Welcome to the second episode in our 12-part series looking at the longer term shifts as a result of COVID-19. And in this particular episode, I'd like to start with a question. And that is COVID-19 the shock to the system that we need to deal with the next crisis, which is the climate crisis? Over the last 50 years, we've perhaps become accustomed to life of convenience and unhindered choice in food and drink, irrespective of consequence. We perhaps all thought that we had a right to continue on this trajectory on this planet that we're all privileged to call home. But we can't escape the fact that it's a finite resource to which we're inflicting damage and long term change. In a crisis where the unthinkable has happened, previously unimaginable approaches have become the new normal overnight. So perhaps this is the blueprint for tackling issues like sustainability, biodiversity, and global food security. In some ways, this crisis has become a dry run for how we as individuals, businesses, governments, and a global community need to approach and proactively plan our response to the climate crisis. Whilst the circumstances and implications of COVID-19 are devastating millions of people and families across the globe, they illustrate how quickly behaviour and actions can change when push comes to shove. We've seen real world practical examples of how a short spell in the reduction in human activity has seen Mother Nature start to repair some of the damage caused to date, such as improved air quality and pollution in densely populated urban areas, translucence of the Venice canals, and the reduction of nitrogen dioxide emissions, all underscoring the urgency of climate change action. The risk of global pandemic was known, as is the climate crisis. Yet the current COVID-19 pandemic serves to highlight the fragility of our food ecosystem. We expect to see a far greater focus on the strength and resilience of our wider food and drink system, because we now know that when a crisis comes, it can come at speed and with global impact. I thought Dave Lewis, Tesco's CEO, said it very well recently. He said, "I think what this crisis has shown is the importance of food and food retail. I think in the past, perhaps we may have taken it for granted. So I hope that as a nation, we think carefully about food, food strategy, and food distribution." Key to the resilience of our total food system is biodiversity. The more variety and less dependence on fewer species, the greater the resilience to climate extremes. And as we know, 75% of the world's food comes from just 12 crops and 5 livestock species. Now more than ever, building a resilience through diversity into our food and food system is a critical imperative. Our food and agriculture systems must be protected at all costs, as they're pivotal to our survival, which means figuring out how to protect the microorganisms, the plants, the creatures that live alongside us on a global level. Farmers' markets and farm-to-table restaurants may seem at the moment like a world away, but those who've frequented them will be familiar with terms like heritage and heirloom. And for many years, these terms have been the reserve of the foodie few. But we expect to see a new relevance in a world where genetic diversity, variety, and species helps drive biodiversity, as well as flavour and nutritional value. And what's more, at a time when community and connectivity with others feels more important, the appeal of heritage farming and farmers is stronger than ever. We expect to see more technological advances driven by the food security and biodiversity agenda. We anticipate change across the agriculture and food production system, from reviving long forgotten crop species to the rise of urban or indoor agriculture that brings food production closer to consumption, making it more transparent, socially conscious, and climate friendly. In the UK in particular, due to Brexit, we've been closely examining our food supply chains and the reliance on inbound trade for some essential food supplies. The pandemic has accelerated this issue even more. On a global scale, the food system has woken up to the fact that supply and demand relationships can disappear overnight. Expect a renewed focus on domestic grown produce and farming, not only for the human and community connection that we discussed in the previous episode, but also from a supply resilience perspective and of course the labour required to farm and harvest. COVID-19 has demonstrated that no one can prosper alone. There is a wider society and we're all part of it. The broader food and drink industry must put collaboration at the heart of what it does, not just on specific issues, such as COVID-19, which it has done so brilliantly over the last few weeks, but also to drive systemic change to tackle the big issues of sustainability and climate action. With consumers paranoid about virus spread, expect to see hygiene, sanitation and welfare in its broadest possible sense reassessed, from farming, food processing, manufacturing to serving food out of home. This, once given, becomes called into question. Is this safe? Hygiene will become a core element of wellness. The speed of virus spread has highlighted the level of contactedness in food and drink and the associated risks if not addressed. In all of our global analysis of research and commentary, the word that comes up time and time over is planning, and the subtle difference between assessing risks, because it was known that a pandemic influenza would have the biggest effect on society and economy, and the detailed response that is required should the unthinkable happen. We now know that the unthinkable can happen. So whether that be as governments, industry, communities, or as individuals, expect a much greater focus on future planning in all aspects of life. Of course as business, but also the need to plan for the future within the consumer psyche, even down to planning our next meal or meals with a contingency just in case. In this article, we've highlighted the shifts that are likely to persist post-pandemic, learning from the shock and devastation from this crisis to apply to the next crisis, the climate crisis. We expect to see a greater focus on biodiversity, varietal diversification, and domestic and local food infrastructure reliance. In addition, food and human hygiene, livestock health in the context of human health, and future planning across all aspects of business and society, all very much front of mind. By considering these longer term shifts and how you as a brand, as a business, startup or entrepreneur pivot and adapt in consideration of them will mean that you're well positioned to succeed in the next normal in food and drink. In Article 3, we'll be looking at a new pragmatism, looking at issues like food waste, store cupboard cooking, seasonality and price sensitivity, all through the lens of the COVID-19 pandemic and the longer term shifts that we expect to see manifest. Join our community for all of the details of episode 3 and all of the latest food and drink trends foresight. Visit thefoodpeople.co.uk and complete your details at the footer of the page. Thanks for listening.